Hello there, it's Alex here, also known as Defaultsound, and today I'm going to do another tutorial in Unreal Engine, and I've had this requested quite a bit on how to do render targets and how you can use them to basically do real-time painting at runtime. So I was looking into this when it came out in 4.13 I think, and I used it in one of my games, and it's actually quite a cool little technique you can use to basically do whiteboards, or you can even do sort of like ground destruction, where like a mortar strike could hit the ground and then displace the ground and leave a decal behind and this sort of thing. But today I'm just going to quickly show you how you can do a simple setup to get the basics and understand the basics of how this works. So in here I've got like a simple plane and then just an arrow mesh which I can move around. We then have a line trace that hits the target mesh, and then we will be able to use that trace hit onto the UVs of this mesh and basically draw a pattern or a mask to where we hit on the UVs. And as we move this arrow around, you can see that in real time we're updating where that arrow hits, and we can paint any sort of pattern we desire at runtime. So first of all, let's set up a few things. So for this tutorial I recommend that you turn on your show engine content, because we'll just be using some quick and easy to access textures. For this example I used the UE4 logo texture. The one thing you have to change on this, if you're going to use this, or for any texture that you want to use as your paint splat, as we will call it, you have to make sure that the X and Y axis tiling methods are clamped, and I'll go into that later on to why that's necessary. But just remember, if you're going to use the texture that will be used to draw, so where we place this splat, that tiling method needs to be clamped. The other thing you want to do is you have to go to edit your project settings, and in your project settings under the physics engine tab, you'll want to make sure that you turn on support UV from hit results. This will require you to restart your engine, so I recommend that you turn that on before we start this tutorial. So first of all, we're going to make two materials. So the first material is going to be our splat material. So I'll just call it splat. I've just got M because I've already made one before. And this is just going to be an empty new material. So this is going to be our little thing that we paint with onto our mesh. So what we're going to do is we're going to set some material properties here on the left. First of all, the blend mode we want to set to additive, and the shading mode we can set to unlit, since we won't be needing any of the other outputs. First thing, we're going to add a texture coordinate, like so. We're then going to make a 3-channel or a constant 3 vector. We're then going to promote it to a parameter, and we'll call this parameter position. We're then going to mask the output of this vector, just for the red and green channel. So this position 3, this vector parameter here, will basically be acting as our position for the UV. So this will be X and this will be Y. We won't need the blue channel because that is not being used. We're only storing 2D values for the UVs. We then will subtract 0.5 from each channel, and the reason we'll do this is to help center the brush stroke in the middle of our of where we trace from. So then we can come in here and then subtract this from our texture coordinate, like so. And then we're going to create a scalar parameter, and we'll call this size. And then we're going to use a function called scale UVs by center. We'll then plug in our scalar parameter into the texture scale, and then we'll just plug in the subtract into the UVs. And then by default we'll just set this to 1 for now. And then we're going to add in a texture sample parameter 2D, And for the texture, we can find that Unreal logo, wherever it is. So this texture parameter is where you can use any texture that you want. So for example, we could use this sort of gradient circle here, or the fog sheet fall off texture, or any texture that you import. It could be like a little sort of rough looking circle to give you like a, if you're doing a whiteboard, you want like a weird looking sort of mask, you can do that. You can use anything really. I can't find this texture now. Just find it over here. And plug it in there. And then we'll plug our UVs into that texture. We'll just rename this parameter to splat mask. And then we can just plug that into our emissive color. And that's it for the splat. So we can save. And that's done. So this will just basically set, whenever we update this vector, it will basically position this mask where it needs to be on in the correct UV place. So that's all this is doing. We'll then go back to our folder up here. We'll create another material and we'll call this canvas material. Now for this one, let me just open up my example so I can remember. This one's quite straightforward. So in this one, this can be as complicated as you want it to be. Depending on what you're blending between, you may need something that you blend between all channels, but for this example, we'll just be lerping between two base colors. So I'm just going to copy and paste. So in here, you just want to get two texture samples that you want to blend between. We're then going to create a parameter, and we'll call this alpha. So what we'll be doing is this splat will be drawn to a render target eventually, and that render target will be drawn to this alpha texture here, or this alpha parameter. We will set the render target to this texture parameter, and then this we will clamp to make sure it's between 0 and 1 for black and white values, and that will be the alpha value that will blend between these two textures here. And obviously, let's say you had a normal texture or a roughness texture or whatever, you can just basically output this back into your alpha and then plug it into the necessary channel, and just keep dragging and dropping that into each channel. So that's it for this material. So all we need to make sure is we have a texture parameter called alpha, and then make sure you clamp that, and then we're just going to lerp it between the two texture samples we need, and that's it for this material. Make sure that's all saved, and then finally, okay, cancel, don't worry about that. And finally, we're going to make our blueprint that makes this all work. So we'll make a new blueprint, just make an actor, we'll call it paint plane, and in here we'll add a static mesh. We'll call it, we'll just call it static mesh for now, and we'll use the default cube, this one, and we'll just scale this down to something like that. We'll add a arrow component like so, and we'll move it up there like that. We'll just make sure it's unhidden in game so we can see it for the sake of demonstration. And then in our construction script, we're going to do a couple of things. Now, when I was working this out back last year, in the examples of what Unreal had given, is they put this, I think it was these two nodes here, into the construction script. And the problem I had with this was every time I tried to package my game, it would crash, and I couldn't understand why. And apparently, I don't know if this has been fixed since, but putting this in construction script will force your game to not compile properly. So the easy fix for this is, if you have seen the example projects, is to move this into the begin play event rather than your construction script, and that will ensure that your game packages correctly. So in the construction script, We'll first create a dynamic material instance. We'll then create we'll get our canvas. We'll then promote this to a variable. We'll call this canvas. Yeah, we'll just call it canvas. We'll then set the material of our static mesh. We'll just plug that material in there and execute that set material. We'll then create another dynamic material instance. This one's going to be our splat material. And then we'll also promote this to a variable. Oh, not a local variable. And we'll call this splat material. And then we can also come out of here and then we can set the scalar parameter. So in here we can set the size parameter we made, and we could change this to whatever we want. 0.515 is quite good if you're doing like a small ink tip of a pen or something like that. But we can make this as small and as big as we like. We can also set the mask parameter here as well if we want. So all we have to do is come out here, set texture parameter value. We can then just set the splat mask, I think we called it. So you have to make sure that this parameter name matches, and then you can just change this to whatever texture you want in the construction script. So that's all that for our construction script. In the event graph, we're just going to use event tick and begin play. In the begin play, we're going to create a render target 2D. 256 by 256 is fine. Upping this resolution will just make the mask effect look clearer or higher res. We're also going to promote this to a variable. We'll just get this, and then we'll go to clear render target 2D. This will just make sure that there is no value in the render target when we begin the game. And then after that, we are going to then set the render target to be that alpha parameter that we set up in the canvas. So in here, we set up this alpha parameter 2D. So this render target will be set to that parameter. So we can just drag and drop the render target into there. And we'll make sure we set this parameter value to be that. I'm just going to double check. So we got splat and canvas, great. So that's that set up. We'll then move on to the event tick. So the event tick, all we're going to do is do a line trace for objects. We will break off this, make an array. We'll just check for static. Just make sure our static mesh is set to static, otherwise it won't trace for it. We'll then enable trace complex. We'll also just set on debug draw for debugging, and we'll just plug the event tick straight into the line trace. Then I'm going to get the arrow. We're going to get world location. It's just a quick and easy way to draw the line trace from the arrow downwards. We get world rotation. Get forward vector, and then we'll multiply this by float, and this value here will be the distance of how long the line trace will be, so you can set this to whatever you want. And then we're going to add vector and vector, and then that will be the distance or the end trace position for the line trace. Then on the out hit, we're going to get fine UV, fine collision UV. So that's the thing I told you to make sure to enable in your project settings. If you do not have this enabled, then this won't work. So make sure you enable that. We'll then right click on the little UV pin, and we're going to split the struct. Then from the line trace executive node, we'll set a we need to get our splat material, and then we're going to set the vector parameter, and this is where we're going to set that position vector that we made in the splat material. And for this value, we're also going to split the pin struct, because we're then just going to plug in the UVX and UVY into these two channels here, and then we can connect up our line trace directly into there. And then finally, we'll then get our render target. We'll then do draw material to render target. No, I don't want that one. Draw material to render target. We'll then plug in our render target. And then last but not least, we will plug in our splat material. And that's it, that we are done for this blueprint. We'll compile and save. We'll delete the example one to see if I've done this all correctly. And then if we simulate, nothing's happening. Okay, let's debug. What have I forgotten? Check all the names are correct. Position. Could be alpha. Okay, the line trace isn't tracing something. So let's see what we've forgotten here. So this is set to static. World static. Oh, I think I know what it is. Yeah, we just need to uncheck ignore self. And now this should work. There we go. And there you have it. So now if we move the arrow component around, you'll see that we draw that mask to wherever the line trace hits on the UVs. And that's it. That's how you do basic render target painting in real time in Unreal Engine 4. Okay, to recap. So what we've done is we've set up a very basic painting with using the render target feature in Unreal Engine 4. What we did is we created two materials. We created a splat material that acts as our paintbrush. We were able to set the position of the paintbrush by using a vector. This vector is then used to position the UVs of our mask, or our paintbrush as we shall say. And we can set this mask to be anything we want, so any design, any shape, depending on what alpha texture you use. You have to make sure that whatever texture you do use is clamped. If you don't clamp it and we just set it to the default wrapped, you will see that it will do this. It will tile that paintbrush across the whole mesh and won't give you the results you want. So you have to make sure you clamp that value. We also worked out that we can use the render target as an alpha to blend between two materials, and that alpha material, or alpha parameter I should say, is set in our blueprint at runtime. Once we've hit the target mesh and updated that position vector, we can then draw that material to the render target. So that's about it. This is how you do a very simple draw to render target in runtime. I hope this tutorial has helped, and I'll see you next time.